I'm thrilled this afternoon to be talking to Lara Friedman, who is the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, based in Washington, D.C. Lara, thank you very much for spending a few minutes with us this afternoon.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
Now, Lara, this will be posted probably in a week or so, but um, people who are watching should know that it's actually taken place the day after those extraordinary events on Capitol Hill, which have really upset the political apple cart in the United States today. But we're going to try to focus on the work of the foundation and on the issue of human rights for Israelis and Palestinians. Lara, just first of all, tell me a little bit about yourself. I read your bio. You were a U.S. Foreign Service officer for some time. How did you come from being a public official to being the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace?
Thanks. It's one of those, I can't, if you had told me 20 years ago this is where I would end up, I would have said, I have no idea how that will happen. Well, it's great to be here. I am indeed the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I started in the Foreign Service immediately after graduate school. I went to graduate school in foreign policy. And almost by accident ended up in the Middle East. My plan coming out of graduate school is actually to work in Africa. And the job just didn't work out that way. The Foreign Service, you serve at the pleasure of the government. And I ended up in Jerusalem and then Washington, then Tunis and Beirut. At that point, I decided I wanted, for my own reasons, to shift out of government service and live in the United States again, to be closer to family and friends. And I did a quick detour on Wall Street. It took me a year to realize that I don't want to be on Wall Street, and made a detour through the nonprofit sector, what I intended to be a short foray into the nonprofit sector, on my way probably back into public service. And I went to work with Americans for Peace Now, it's a liberal Zionist organization, and started off working on government affairs and eventually took over the whole policy portfolio there along with government affairs. And after many, many years there, because it wasn't a short detour, I realized this is something that I am passionate about and that I feel a moral obligation to be engaged in for various reasons. And then from there, I moved to the foundation where I am today.
Give us a word about those moral obligations.
So I come at this as someone who was raised as I'm Jewish, I'm American. I was raised in a home that was Zionist, in the sense that most American Jews are Zionist. It's something you don't even really think about. It's almost part, definitionally part of being Jewish is supporting Israel. My grandfather was an ardent Zionist, and very active. And it wasn't something that I thought about a lot until my first tour in the Foreign Service, when I served in Jerusalem. And there in the early 90s, I found myself responsible for part of that time for the settlement portfolio, where I was the US government official reporting on settlements. And I was reporting in that era on the continuing violence after the first Intifada. I was the lead officer reporting on the Hebron massacre, when an American Israeli settler massacred Palestinians at prayer in the Ibrahimi Mosque, Tomb of the Patriarchs in Hebron. There's a certain point when, as an American and as a Jewish American coming from that background, you look at this and say, a lot of this is being done in my name.
Mm-hmm.
It's being done in my name as a Jew, and it's being done in my name as an American. And I was raised, again, both as an American and as a Jewish American, to believe that I have a responsibility, whether it is for fighting racism in my society or for fighting homophobia, whatever the issues are, and that there's a particular obligation when you are complicit, when you are, somehow deliberately or not deliberately complicit in what's going on. So, my years in the Foreign Service, this is one of those issues that dogs you at every turn. Wherever you're doing in the Middle East, this issue comes up. And leaving the Foreign Service, it rested with me, because you can't unknow the things you know, and you can't unsee the things you've seen. If you're not going to be active once you've seen what's happening in the West Bank, then you're going to have to find some way to rationalize, so you can look at yourself in the mirror and say, I am still a good moral person, even though I am closing my eyes to and maybe even deliberately enabling these terrible things to happen in my name.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for sharing that with us. So you went to an American Americans for Peace Now, is that the name? And then you came to the foundation. Give us a line or two on the mission of the foundation. What's the foundation do? What's it about?
Sure. So the Foundation for Middle East Peace is a really, I would say this even before I came to work with it. It's a really cool organization created by a gentleman named Merle Thorpe back long before there was a peace process. He established the organization back in the 80s before most people had the courage or vision to talk about, Israeli-Palestinian peace or the need for a Palestinian state. He had a whole variety of partners in the Jewish community and outside the Jewish community, including a gentleman named Phil Klutznick, whose son went on to be the head of the chair of the board for the Americans for Peace Now, who I knew very well, Jim Klutznick, I know him well. And Merle had this vision and the sense of obligation that for the US and for the benefit of the region, for Israelis and Palestinians, he always framed it that way. There was a necessity to resolve this conflict, to build ties with both peoples, to legitimize and humanize both peoples, and to get to a solution. When he died, he left a chunk of his assets to keep the foundation going, which puts us in a really special position. We are, in some ways, a grant-giving organization. That's one of our main purposes. We have, for decades, supported NGOs on the ground in the human rights and civil society sector, organizations that are pushing in the US for a two-state solution or for negotiations or for Palestinian rights. That's a big part of what we do. And in some ways, I think it's even more important now than it has been at any point since the start of the peace process, because that sector is under greater pressure than ever before.
I saw on your website that you have quite a range of organizations, but Palestinian and Israeli.
We do.
That you're helping, right?
And again, the era when the organization was started, for the years before the peace process, what Merle Thorpe and his colleagues were doing, and some of the board members today are from that era, they're amazing and courageous. What they were doing then was remarkably courageous. It was almost unheard of to legitimize and humanize and work with Palestinians. And they deserve enormous credit for that. In the years since, I think it maybe people saw it as less courageous because sure, everyone dealing with B'Tselem or Al-Haq, I don't think people understand that it was always courageous to stay engaged. And now it's sort of come full circle. And in some ways, it's almost as challenging now as it was before the peace process. So that's one piece of what we do. And it's an important piece. And we're enormously proud of our grantees. The other piece of it is the policy piece. I mean, we're a foundation. We don't engage in any kind of lobbying. We don't lobby the White House. We don't lobby Congress at all. But we engage in policy work.
And you monitor quite carefully what's happening, both at the administration level and in Congress, right?
We do. So a part of that is, I mean, I have been from my work at Peace Now through today, and the work today is sort of a joint, we jointly post it with Peace Now because it was born there. I've been doing a weekly piece monitoring everything Middle East that happens on Capitol Hill. That goes back now like 15 years, and I brought it with me when I came to the foundation. In addition, since I came to the foundation, my colleague Kristen McCarthy, who is just so smart, she has launched a weekly piece monitoring everything happening in settlement activity. The foundation for years has been known as a locus of information on settlements. A gentleman named Jeff Aronson, who was one of the most brilliant settlement watchers ever and a great analyst, for many years published a quarterly printed report on settlements, and we have archives of that. That had stopped for a while. It's a huge investment of energy. The amount of research that went into that. I mean, Jeff is incredible. We started it, but in a very different form. And in some ways, it's much more limited. But it's just weekly, but it's comprehensive and with links. The idea being that information is power. I mean, in the sense of empowering people. If you care, that's great. That's a starting point. But it's not enough to care. You have to know. And we want to empower, whether it's activists or it's journalists or it's policymakers, whoever it is, you should know everything. And maybe when you know everything, you'll still disagree. You'll disagree with me on what should happen, but at least we start with the facts being there. Mm-hmm. So that's a big piece of what we do. And we also do a lot of programming. Sort of like this conversation you and I are having today. We always did a lot of programming. The foundation for years has been the home for, I would say, some of the most courageous programming in Washington with various Israeli and Palestinian NGOs. With COVID, we've moved to this virtual platform, and we've been able to launch an unprecedented both volume of programming, because it's not expensive. It's just a matter of our own efforts. But in addition to the volume, because we don't have to have our guests in Washington on a stage with us, we've been able to be really much more, I think, creative in accessing voices from Israel, Palestine, and elsewhere in the Middle East, in Europe. Whatever the issue is, we can bring these voices together and host, I think, really remarkable conversations.
Well, that's sort of what brings me to your door today, because now when you're doing these webinars, particularly, they become accessible to Canadians in a way that they would not have been accessible. Someone might have had some money to go down to Washington and attend a conference or something that becomes very expensive. Now you can bring your intelligence, your intelligence in a research sense, perspectives to us. We can piggyback off that, and I think it's a tremendous resource for Canadians. Now, in the webinars, I've noticed, Lara, that you've actually brought in quite a wide variety of people, Palestinians and Israeli. What's your general philosophy about who you are prepared to bring to the table, and what kind of discussions are you prepared to have or not prepared to have, or how do you draw boundaries, if any, around that?
So I don't think we have any boundaries in the sense of there are ideas that are not allowed, right? I've had conversations with people who say, well, I don't want to be, I don't want to do an event with you. A Palestinian says it because we don't do events with organizations that host Israelis, and I respect that. That's your prerogative, but we're not gonna not host Israeli voices. And I've had conversations with friends of mine and people I know in the Jewish community and Israelis who say, well, I don't want to be on your webinar because you allow voices that speak in support of BDS. And my answer is, that's fine. You don't have to come, but we don't have a litmus test. These ideas are legitimate. They're important. This needs to be discussed. And to the extent that we have some actual hard and fast rules, I will say some of this is just a reflection of things we should have all been doing all along, but maybe we didn't think about it. Like there has to be, there's going to be women and men, ideally in equal numbers, on every single panel we do. We are going to have, if this is a discussion that's supposed to represent the whole range of issues, the whole range of perspectives, we're not going to have anybody but Palestinians representing a Palestinian perspective. The history in Washington of having, three Jews with three American Jews and one Israeli, but they say, well, there's a progressive American Jew, so they can give the Palestinian viewpoint. That's part of how we got here, right? Or we're not going to say, well, this Palestinian is kosher, so they can describe the Palestinian viewpoints that we don't want to have in person because maybe BDS or whatever. So I think we still have work to do. It requires people to be, I think, much more conscious as they're putting together panels. But the funny thing, and this is something that I think should have again been obvious to us all along, is that the more you do this and the more you are conscious and conscientious of things like ideological balance, gender balance, national balance, all of that, the easier it gets because you just keep getting a bigger and bigger circle of brilliant voices that you maybe didn't know about before. And it's exponential. And we all get smarter in the process.
Lara, you're also a very good interviewer as well. You draw on your background in the Middle East and your context to ask good questions of your interviewees. I've seen probably 3 or 4 webinars recently that you've done. Is there any one or two that sort of stand out you as ones where you felt you learned something particular that you hadn't really appreciated before?
So I will be humble in answering that because I learn something in every webinar I do. That's part of the fun of, the format that we've adopted for people who've attended webinars. The traditional format is you have 3 or 4 guests or 2 or 3 guests. Each of them speaks for 15 minutes or something, and then you open it up to audience Q&A. I hate that format. I don't think it does I think it does a disservice to the guests, and I think it does a disservice to the audience. Our format is we figure out in advance the questions that we're going to ask. Nobody gives prepared statements, so no, it doesn't seem like anybody's selling anything. And in the process, I get to make sure that they're saying things that I need answers for, right?
Mm-hmm.
I have that privilege. And then throughout the webinar, we pay attention to the Q&A box from the audience and draw in their questions as well. And in every single webinar we do, the audience comes up with questions that I had not thought of and that are fantastic. And that I will say one of the fun things we started doing right away, because we got so many questions from the audience, you can't cover everything in an hour and a half, is we started saying, explicitly to the audience, make, whether or not we get to your question, put it in the box, because we're going to give a written list of all the questions to all of our panelists to help guide them as they're doing their thinking and writing and speaking going forward, because your questions are a guide.
Lara, your webinars are free. Do people join FMEP? How do you do solicit donations? What you're sitting on this pot of gold from the beginning, but these things cost money. So
No, so we do not solicit grassroots donations. Occasionally people come to us and say, we'd love to support your work. And our answer, for small donors is, look at our list of grantees, please, we encourage you. And if you go to our website, you'll see we have grantee pages. We have a page for each of our grantees or partners on the ground. And the link in there, the donate button, goes to their page, not to us. We want to encourage people to donate directly to the organizations that need it. The webinars are free. If people want information about them, they can subscribe on our website, and our website has, we have the kind of subscription where you can tick the box for the things you want. So if you don't want to get things like our weekly roundup of Capitol Hill or settlements, don't tick those boxes and you won't. But you can get as much or as little as you want, and we won't spam you.
I'll put the link to your website on the post so that people can follow up if they want to do so.
I would
Lara,
also, sorry,
yeah, please.
I would also add, I don't want to take too much time. We have other resources on our website. We have the luxury as sort of a quasi think tank to pick the issues that we think are the most important and do a lot of work on them. So for folks who, for example, are following the work around the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which I know has been a big issue in Canada, it's a growing issue here. Enormous number of resources on that on the website, because I have been researching that almost obsessively now for a few years. We have an enormous amount of research on the website about efforts around lawfare, the efforts to use courts and legislation to target critics of Israel and free speech, as well as around the efforts or in the US around BDS and legislation targeting BDS. So you can find a lot of other resources that are there. And they're there to be used. They're meant as a resource for the world.
Lara Friedman, president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Thank you very much first of all, congratulations for the excellent, really interesting work and thoughtful work you're doing. And thank you for spending a few minutes with us today. And perhaps some of my Canadian subscribers will find it worthwhile. At least check out your website and see what they see, and maybe go to a webinar or not. And I'm sure they'll be impressed with what they find. Thank you very much, Lara.
Thank you very much for having me.